Okay. All right, guys. It is chapter 8. It is now the Cuban Missile Crisis, by far the longest chapter of the video series about the Cold War. Let me just fix the mic there. There we go. In chapter 7, what did we see again? Yes, the non-aligned movement and the Vietnam War. So, guys, understand communism had spread to China, to the nation of North Korea, and also to Vietnam. And then in the year 1958, sorry, not 1958, 1959, we see the success of the Cuban Revolution. So Fidel Castro, Raul Castro, Che Guevara, and other devoted communists, devoted Marxists, they start a revolution to overthrow the leadership of Batista, the guy who was in charge of Cuba at that time. Now, why? Why were they so upset? What was going on in Cuba that made them believe that they needed a revolution? As I spoke about before with you guys, revolutions don't just happen, right? The American Rev, the French Rev, the Russian Rev, there was all a lot of crap going on in those nations that eventually made the people rise up and go down a different path for themselves. So in Cuba, prior to the Cuban Revolution, was basically a playground for the wealthy in America, for the rich and famous. One sec, bread's done. All right, here we go. Anyways, the revolution in Cuba happened because of the fact that Cubans were extremely poor, and Castro and his brother Raul, Fidel and Raul, thought that Cuba was an island that was just exploited by the rich and powerful. You know what I mean? So they enacted a revolution. Now, going into the questions here. Number 17, why was the military coup of Fidel Castro a problem for America? And the answer to that, guys, is the fact that Cuba is about 110 miles away from the United States of America. Now, please understand, America's dominant foreign policy during the Cold War was one of containment. And when communism was on the other side of the world, in China, in North Korea, in Vietnam, America didn't like it. But now it's literally in America's backyard, right? This would be like, if you were a Ku Klux Klan member and you had all of a sudden a family of non-white immigrants move next door to you. You know what I mean? You would not be happy about this. So the fact that there was now a communist nation in America's backyard, America was like, no, not going to happen. So number 18, it asks, what was the American response to the it should be the coup of Castro, not the election, but the coup of Castro. What was the outcome? Well, initially, guys, what America tried to do was something called the Bay of Pigs invasion. So on southwestern Cuba, there's a bay that has wild pigs, hence the name, the Bay of Pigs. And basically, the American government went to Cuban exiles in Florida, in the city of Miami. There's a large neighborhood called Little Havana, and they basically found these exiles who fled during the Castro Revolution, right? They didn't want to see communism happen in that country. And they basically said, hey, do you guys hate communism? Do you hate Castro? And they're like, yes, we do. And they're like, hey, how about we help you get your country back? And the United States government trained them, they armed them, and they promised them air support for this invasion, for this attempted upheaval of the Castro government. And the outcome of it was an absolute utter failure. Why? Well, number one, Castro and the Cuban communists knew that the operation was going to happen. They had spies that gained information. They were ready for it. And number two, the Kennedy administration, President Kennedy, he crippled the operation, the air support for the operation at the last second. So basically, these Cuban exiles went it alone against the Cuban government, and they were not successful. Now, number 19, after the failed attempt at Castro's political upheaval, what was America's response to cripple the nation of Cuba under Castro? The answer to that, guys, is an economic embargo. The U.S. imposed sanctions against Cuba. And basically what the U.S. wanted to do was have no more dealings with Cuba. Now, I want you to think about this for a sec. The largest economy in the world is the United States of America. And Cuba is a neighboring nation to the United States of America. To be cut off, economically speaking, from Cuba would have been economic death for that island. And basically what America wanted to do was, like, when people get desperate enough, hungry enough, they tend to revolt against their government. So by cutting off Cuba from the American economy, America was hoping that the situation in Cuba would get so desperate that the people would rise up, kind of like what we saw in Russia in 1917. They would rise up against the government and oust it and replace it with something else. So instead of an actual assassination or, you know, the Bay of Pigs invasion, what would happen would be, and that, by the way, that was the goal of the Bay of Pigs invasion, was to assassinate Fidel Castro. Instead of that, what their response was to try to cripple them economically so that the people of Cuba would rise up against their government. Now, did it work? No. What did this cause Castro to do? Kind of the second half of question number 19. All that it did is it pushed Castro towards Nikita Khrushchev. Nikita Khrushchev was looking for an ally in the West. And Castro was the perfect ally. So it's like, here's Cuba, and they now hate America. And here's the Soviet Union, and they hate America. And then they became friends, right? They became friends. Now, number 20, with the mass exodus of East Berliners to democratic West Berlin, what was Khrushchev's response? Khrushchev put up the Berlin Wall, 100 miles long, 12 feet high, like 3-4 feet thick. And number 21 says, how were defectors from East Berlin going to West Berlin treated by East Berlin troops? So once the wall went up, people in East Berlin and West Berlin were separated up until the falling of the wall in 1989. And I don't want to date myself, but I actually watched, as a young man, the Berlin Wall coming down on CNN, right? America's trusted news source, back in 1989. And yeah, it was pretty interesting history. So anyways, once the wall went up, right, there were East Berlin wall guards, stations every, few hundred feet or so. And anyone in East Berlin who tried to flee to West Berlin in order to get on a plane and just get the heck out of East Germany, there were orders to shoot to kill. And if you actually do a little bit of Googling, like, escape attempts from East Berlin, you will see that all sorts of creative methods were used to try to gain their freedom. There's stories of individuals who used hot air balloons to try to float over the Berlin Wall and land in West Berlin. Some people tried to drive through the wall, right, like actually crash into it with their car and try to bring it down. That didn't work very often. And also there was people who tried to dig tunnels underneath the wall. And some people actually successfully did dig tunnels from East Berlin underneath the wall and then into West Berlin. So kind of crazy. Now, number 22. What was the Cuban Missile Crisis? How is it significant in the history of the Cold War? Cuban Missile Crisis, guys, is the gravest confrontation of the Cold War, and you would have seen them call it that in the documentary. It lasted for 13 days. During this time period, guys, if this line I'm making with my hand, right here, represents tensions getting to the point of nuclear war happening, then tensions went up and up and up and up and almost got to that point, right? They almost got to that point. If they would have hit that point, poof, the mushroom clouds go off, right? And it's significant in the history of the Cold War because, guys, it's the closest the world has ever come to nuclear war, right? The US went to what is called Defense Condition 2 or DEFCON 2. I don't know if you ever heard that term before. But yeah, DEFCON 1 means hit the buttons, light the cigarettes, drink the whiskey, the world is done. Peace out with everything. And thankfully, we never got there. Now, how did we not get there? Through diplomacy. And that is the answer for question number 24. How was nuclear war avoided during the Cuban Missile Crisis? Diplomacy. They talked it out. Now, I skipped ahead one question here. Number 23 says, what was the American response to the presence of Soviet missiles in Cuba? The American response was a naval blockade. So, picture my finger as the island of Cuba, right? Boats would be coming towards Cuba containing nuclear missiles. And basically, the United States sent naval ships from Florida down to the island of Cuba, and then they went to kind of block the ships from being able to get across from the Soviet Union containing those missiles all the way to Cuba. Yeah, so a naval blockade is what America's response was. And just for the record, the troop mobilization that occurred during the 13 days of the Cuban Missile Crisis was the largest troop mobilization since World War II at that time. So yeah, America was a little bit worried about the idea of having nuclear missiles pointed at them on an island, 110 miles away. And these missiles could strike basically anywhere in the United States of America, or the so-called lower 48, right? Excluding Alaska and Hawaii. Although if you know anything about the geography of the Soviet Union, you know that based on the fact that the globe is a sphere and not a flat map, that Alaska and the Soviet Union are basically right beside each other. So Alaska's probably not safe either. Maybe Hawaii. Now, moving on here, number 25, explain what mutually assured destruction, or MAD, is and how it helped lay the groundwork towards nuclear arsenal limitation. MAD, mutually assured destruction, is the idea that, if both countries are sufficiently stockpiled in their nuclear weapons, that no one is going to mess with you because their destruction would be mutually assured. So think about it. Like if the US launches a first strike against the Soviet Union, right, as the missiles are flying over the top of the earth towards the Soviet Union, the Soviets would be like, oh, there's missiles coming. And then they will launch missiles as well. And both sides will be, poof, 3,000 degree fireball, a whole lot of vaporized people, and not a lot of fun, right? So mutually assured destruction is sort of like that razor's edge that kept the US and the USSR from launching a first strike, because they know that technically nobody wins a nuclear war, right? Not everybody, but a lot of people die, and life as we know it changes dramatically. Then number 26, Khrushchev's ousted from power. Who's the new leader? A man by the name of Leonid Brezhnev. And Brezhnev is a return to the hard line that the Soviet Communist Party has. And then lastly, number 27, what was the Brezhnev Doctrine? The Brezhnev Doctrine is basically the promise or the right to violate the sovereignty of any nation, turning its back on communism. So if any Warsaw Pact nation, any nation behind the Iron Curtain, is thinking about trying to leave the sphere of influence of the Soviet Union, then that will be terminated very, very quickly. So it's basically the threat that if you leave, we will not allow that to happen. Or if you try to leave, we will not allow that to happen. All right, that is chapter 8. After the Cuban Missile Crisis, guys, what we're going to see here is The world is pretty tired of the threat of nuclear annihilation, and no kidding, right? So we enter into a new stage of the Cold War known as détente, right? So tensions go up during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and then they sort of plateau for those 13 days, and then we see in the 1970s this new era called détente. So we'll check that out in the next chapter and then in the next video explanation of what's going on here. Peace with you.